Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen. Welcome to Module 5, Media and Courts, Part 4. So we're going to go into more of the types of pretrial publicity out there and some of the research on it, as well as some examples to make this even more clear than maybe it was previously. So again, just by way of review, pretrial publicity is defined as a debate between the right to a free press, which is guaranteed by the First Amendment, and a right to an impartial jury guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment, and the clash that occurs because of those rights. So yes, we want the press there, we want coverage, we want the truth to emerge, we need oversight and watchdog type behaviors, but at the same time, it shouldn't put undue influence on someone and their right to a fair and impartial jury if they were on trial. So again, those clashes are what is at play here. Media reports of prejudicial case are relevant information, so they give us the information about what's going on in a case. And again, by way of reminder, that information may or may not be admissible at trial, but could cause a potential juror to prejudge the defendant's guilt before they were summoned to come to a jury. It can cause an increase in bias against the defendant and can affect pre- and post-trial guilt judgments of mock jurors. So again, we have very good research to support this effect. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about two types of pretrial publicity. The first is case-specific pretrial publicity, and the second is general pretrial publicity, which we talked a little bit about in the CSI lectures back a module ago. So first, we're going to talk about case-specific pretrial publicity. So this is media exposure to a certain case affecting the jurors' attitudes about the case, maybe the defendant, the plaintiff, or beliefs about the defendant's guilt, which then affects the jurors' case judgments and their own interpretation of the evidence. It is very specific, and it's coverage specific to the case that's currently going on. So there are two different types of case-specific pretrial publicity. The first is factual, and the second is emotional. So factual is simply just information about the case, the facts, but that it's provided to you in advance before you have a chance to look at it through direct examination and cross-examination provided in court, versus the emotional would be more of the stories, and these kind of tug at our heartstrings a little bit, making us feel empathy for what's going on. And essentially, when we do research on these effects, the research does show a stronger effect for the emotional side of case-specific pretrial publicity, like hearing about the devastation of victim family members versus maybe the factual side, an actual confession that was admitted at court. So there is a very strong effect for the emotions, as you could probably imagine. So this is a quick illustration of how case-specific pretrial publicity actually works. So let's say you're given some case-specific pretrial publicity information about a case. Then this would in turn influence your case attitudes. Okay, so now you start having ideas about what's actually going on in the case, again, well before or in advance of or ahead of the trial. And then lastly, this would inform your case judgments and maybe influence the kind of verdict that you render in that specific case. So let's give you an example to show you the process. So let's say you were given images and facts about a recent BP oil spill, being shown some of what the accident was about, and you saw some news coverage about this tragic accident. This would in turn inform your attitudes about BP's potential negligence in the case, because you've been exposed to a lot of different imagery and discussion about what happened. Again, simply the facts being reported by news media. This in turn would influence negligent verdicts in the BP case, saying, well, yeah, I mean, clearly it was documented. I saw negligence on their side. But again, these are preconceived notions in advance of the case as it plays out. You're kind of going into the trial with a loaded attitude. But this is the factual side. Do you want to see the same example with maybe the emotional side? Let's show you. So let's take the same case, the BP oil spill. But let's say instead of those factual images, you were shown images of dead animals or animals soaked in oil, and maybe even heard some of the emotional outcries from environmental activists or families or people finding these animals on the beach, suffering and tortured and so forth. So again, it's that emotional heartstring story. This would in turn inform even stronger attitudes about BP's negligence because you just experienced or witnessed some suffering. And then again, this would inform even more negligent verdicts in the BP case. So you'd come even with stronger preconceived notions about BP's lack of responsibility to keeping the oceans clean. So this is how you can see a case kind of being so prolific in the media atmosphere that sometimes it's hard to try to prevent the influence that is out there because we're exposed to so many things well in advance of a trial actually occurring. But now let's talk about general pretrial publicity. So again, general pretrial publicity addresses just the topic. So maybe we read about an oil spill by another company, not necessarily BP, but we start to get some ideas about it or about oil spills in general and who's at fault. So this essentially is media exposure to topics not directly related to the actual case itself, the specificness of who the plaintiff or the defendants are, but it can affect attitudes about the general topic, which in turn affects jurors' decisions on trials that have to do with these topics. Okay, so essentially these are much weaker effects than maybe case-specific pretrial publicity, as you can imagine, but we can kind of put this into play by looking at a video that I actually included on the module, When Eyewitnesses Are Wrong. So let's say we viewed this video and started to be more skeptical about eyewitness testimony in a case, just generally eyewitness testimony. So you can actually go watch that video, it's only about 5 minutes, and see how maybe that might inform you in the future. So if we're exposed to general pretrial publicity about a topic, this in turn would influence our attitude about those very same case topics and our own interpretation of the evidence presented at a trial involving that topic. That would also influence our actual case judgment about guilt or not guilt, or be in favor of the defense or in favor of the plaintiff in some shape or form, again, based on some of that prior exposure. So in the example of watching the When Eyewitnesses Are Wrong film, we watch the film, we actually get attitudes about eyewitnesses and the reliability of eyewitnesses, and then in turn we start to interpret the eyewitness evidence a little bit differently than maybe we would have before in the case we're assigned to, and then we would actually find an outcome of more not guilty judgments rendered in that case because we've been generally exposed to it. So hopefully this gives you an example of how some of this could actually work out with jurors and potential jurors. So how did we actually discover this effect? Well, there was a researcher by the name of Green, and Green discovered the effect in an experiment examining the effect of eyewitness evidence on juror decision-making on verdicts. So essentially, she would show a film that would actually challenge eyewitness identification, and kind of with a control group and a treatment group in a classic experiment. And essentially the film focused on mistaken eyewitness identification. And people that saw the film did not give it much merit when it was presented as evidence, eyewitness evidence in a case, due to this recently viewed show. So they started to be more skeptical of the eyewitness testimony than they would have before. This was the actual experiment that happened. Now, this same effect was later examined in laboratory experiments where we had mock trials and we kind of look at different influences and so forth. They're a little bit harder to come by, but you can find those research articles out there. And generally speaking, research has a large amount of support in the literature about a consistent effect of pretrial publicity. Again, not necessarily for CSI effects, but specifically pretrial publicity, whether it's in the specific form, the case-specific form, or the general form. There is large agreement about the effects that it has, and therefore in our next lecture we'll start to see some of the ramifications and restrictions that are now at work because of this support. We'll see you then. Let me know if you have questions. Bye-bye.